Welcome to the ViniMark podcast, a collection of interviews with thought leaders of the wine world, brought to you by ViniMark.
200 plus different strains that you can find commercially. There are many hundreds, thousands more. The latest research has shown that a lot of these different yeasts use different sources of nitrogen, different yeasts using as biocontrol agents. If you're looking at lower ethanol, ending up with a natural, lower alcohol wine without actually doing any alcohol removal. I'm very excited about the non-Saccharomyces yeast.
That was the voice of one Neil Jolly, a senior microbiologist at the Post-Harvest and Agro-Processing Technologies Division of the Agricultural Research Council at South Africa's Infruitec-Nietvoorbij research station. Neil has spent his life working in the field of wine microbiology, but more specifically in the field of non-Saccharomyces yeasts and their role in the improvement of wine quality. I caught up with him earlier this week to unpack the modern history of wine yeast, but also to dip our toe into the very exciting future of wine and the role of non-Saccharomyces yeasts. Now, these have largely been ignored for the past 65 years, even though people have known about them, but they're now being recognized as part of the next frontier in winemaking technology. So let's rewind to the beginning so you can hear all that Neil has to say. Hi, Neil. Thank you so much for taking time to chat to us today. I've been looking forward to this conversation all week.
Hi, Jono.
I often get asked why I get hung up on the topic of wine yeasts when talking about winemaking, and I get told that I should be focused more on terroir or something romantic like that. But with all the technological changes that are happening in the wine yeast industry, I feel like the sort of yeast that one uses could be deemed even more influential than perhaps terroir could on a final wine. So I wondered where you sit on the spectrum of those two positions.
Well, obviously, I'm a wine microbiologist, so I am on the side of the yeast. In the whole environment, they're on the grapes, they're on the equipment. If you're harvesting grapes and you're bringing them into your cellar, and if you just allow them to do their thing, it'll be what we call a spontaneous fermentation.
Spontaneous fermentation is something that winemakers have started to make a big deal of in the last 10 years or so, at least in South Africa. Can you explain how a spontaneous fermentation was different to whatever a normal fermentation might be?
Okay, I don't think we can talk about normal, but let's say spontaneous versus inoculated. You've got your yeast on your grapes, on your equipment. So if you just allow the fermentation to proceed, those yeasts that are there will start to grow and develop, and you'll get a sequential formation or sequential dominance of the different species, starting with your non-Saccharomyces yeast, and eventually your Saccharomyces cerevisiae will take over. If that is what you want, because that is the yeast that's going to get your wine to dryness. However, things can go wrong, and so you have a risk with spontaneous fermentation. The things that can go wrong is that the fermentation doesn't proceed to dryness, so you have what we call a stuck fermentation, and you can get off odors. And so what happened then in the wine microbiology, different yeasts were isolated, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and they went through a commercialization process so they could make them in a dried form, something that you could buy and put into your grape juice when you wanted it. And depending on where they were isolated, they maybe had different properties. Some were better for red wine, some were for white wine. So inoculated fermentation obviously is safer. It's your outcome. The spontaneous fermentation can give you a better product, but it's a higher risk situation. So depending on the size of your ferment, how much risk are you wanting to take?
From what I'm understanding is that when you use spontaneous fermentation, there's a broad range of yeasts and microbes that can all just jump into the grapes, and they all have different little pathways and different byproducts. And so some of those can cause terrible results in your wine. And so there was a need to focus and pick the good ones. Is this a modern era thing, or were there some very clever winemakers in eons past that in a sort of non-technological sense were able to start isolating yeast strains?
Yeah, I don't have all the history in front of me, but it was, I think in the 1960s was the first commercial dried yeast that was released in America, and it developed from there. Prior to that, they were growing the yeast up in the laboratory, small scale, propagating it and then inoculating their ferments. But I think it's the 60s that it really became the active dried product. So although they were focusing on the Saccharomyces cerevisiae yeast, which just became known as the wine yeast, they were aware of all the other yeasts in the wine fermentation, and they knew that some of them could be beneficial, but because they were mostly being isolated from spoilt wines, there was a blanket distaste for these yeasts, which we now call non-Saccharomyces yeast, and they were seen as spoilage yeast. Then we went through an era where the yeast was seen to only impart or only convert the sugar to ethanol and carbon dioxide, and that was pretty much its role in the fermentation. It might have formed some esters, which were important for in the younger wines. But today we know that the yeasts do much more than that. They can convert precursors in the grape juice into volatile aromatics. So today's understanding, we have flavors of wine come directly from the grape, some esters which are formed during the fermentation, and then some yeast-mediated precursors being converted into aromatics. For instance, your Sauvignon Blanc, if you think of your guava, thiol type of aromas, that's more the last type.
So you were saying that it started out isolating Saccharomyces cerevisiae to prevent spoilage, and you said you already knew that there were other strains that were beneficial, but when was it that they started developing Saccharomyces yeasts that in themselves could be beneficial? And you often read this yeast product will boost berry and floral flavors. When did that whole idea begin?
The shift from the yeast being just a generator of ethanol and carbon dioxide to actually playing a much more important role in South Africa, I would say that happened in the late 80s, 1990s. Internationally, probably a little bit earlier. But in the non-Saccharomyces yeast, that interest really started around about early 90s to mid 90s, when it really worldwide there was a renewed interest in non-Saccharomyces yeasts.
When they were beginning to isolate yeasts back in the 60s and deliver them to the market, why was Saccharomyces the first choice?
If you look at the spontaneous fermentation, you all get all your different types of yeasts initially. At the end of the fermentation, the dominant yeast is your Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So it is the strongest yeast, and you can't really do a fermentation without Saccharomyces cerevisiae.
Where was Saccharomyces cerevisiae first isolated? I've been reading a lot of things that talk about how it evolved with human cultures around the planet. Is there any evidence of that?
I think there's a lot of debate about where it actually evolved and if it sort of evolved in the cellar environment together with humans. It is everywhere, but whether it evolved at a certain stage might have been thousands or maybe millions of years ago.
I was reading about yeasts that were isolated specifically in Montalcino in Italy, and that was because they were isolated in order to make a classic authentic Sangiovese, because Sangiovese thrives in Montalcino. So to me, that seemed like a fantastic idea of taking a yeast from the region where a cultivar is indigenous and making a so-called authentic wine. But wine purists often balk at this idea and almost say, well, if you're inoculating with yeast, then by definition, it's not authentic. It is an industrial wine, and authentic wine has to be native. Where did this idea come from?
I think there's a lot of marketing involved. If you're harvesting grapes, you're bringing them into your cellar and you're not using any inoculant. Obviously, you are working with the yeast in your environment, be it on the grapes or in your cellar. So your cellar is quite a good source of Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and your grapes are quite a good source of your non-Saccharomyces yeast. So if you want to be purist, you are then expressing your terroir because you are doing everything with what is there. If you want to be more risk-free, then you would use an inoculated yeast. But that doesn't mean that if you isolate a yeast in Italy and then now use it in South Africa, you're suddenly going to have an Italian flavor to your wine. It doesn't quite work like that.
Okay, so essentially Saccharomyces cerevisiae will deliver very similar results regardless of where it's isolated?
Yeah, it will be fairly similar. Obviously, the yeasts differ in various respects. They're genetically different, so they might form more or less of certain aromatic compounds, but they are generally very similar, and that is why I think the people that talk about the industrial wines, they say that all these wines are becoming very much more similar to each other, and that's why there probably was a move back to your spontaneous fermentation, so doing what nature intended, which gives good results, but can go wrong horribly.
So before we move on to the non-Saccharomyces strains, I just wanted to ask one more question about one of these so-called industrial yeasts, and that is Anker's Vin 7, which seems to have created a storm in New Zealand and in South Africa. What made that particular yeast stand out so much from the rest if Saccharomyces is, by and large, much of a muchness? Why did Vin 7 become a sort of celebrity yeast?
Maybe various reasons, depending on how you look at the genetics. It's a natural hybrid of Cerevisiae and I think it's Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So it is slightly different to your standard Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and it tends to give very nice aromatics for your Chenin Blanc and Sauvignon Blanc type of wines.
You said back at the beginning, winemakers or any fermenters really would just allow what was ever in the area to settle, and then they'd hope for the best. Then came the technology to isolate yeast strains, and these then allowed really safe fermentations, but there wasn't really too much interest in the other functions. And then you were saying that the benefit of various yeast strains was realized, but it wasn't really focused on because Saccharomyces cerevisiae was just such a safe, solid, powerful fermentation. So what was the reason that there was almost a revived interest in all these more minor non-Saccharomyces strains that previously had just been seen as spoilage yeasts?
If you go back into literature, 1960s, 50s, 60s, they really knew that these yeasts could be of benefit. And I think it's with more modern technology, possibly where we are using maybe less sulfur in our wines, which was added initially also to kill off your undesired yeasts. And as things have changed, as with modern technology using less sulfur and with more modern techniques in the laboratory where we can actually start seeing that these yeasts are present in the fermentation and surviving to much later in the fermentation, not necessarily dying off so quickly. And that's, I think, where the new interest came, and also that they can now show that these yeasts are adding certain aromatics to the wine or even mouthfeel properties. So it's not that it was never known. It was always known in the background that there was a renewed interest in these yeasts around about late 80s, 1990s to today. But the big problem is, and this is why are there so few of them around? So the non-Saccharomyces yeasts tend to be less ethanol tolerant. So although they're present at the start of the fermentation and can persist to quite far into fermentation, even towards the end, they are the weaker species. And so Saccharomyces needs to take over. And then the non-Saccharomyces yeasts also can't ferment to dryness. So you will always end up with some residual sugar, which is not what you want. The other big problem we experience is that yeast manufacturers over the years are very much geared for producing Saccharomyces cerevisiae in their factories. So they have that down to a fine art. So when you're working with a non-Saccharomyces yeast, the cell size is very different, it's usually much smaller. They have different growth requirements. So it's a big challenge to the yeast manufacturers to actually grow these yeasts up in a form that they can put into a packet that they can sell to the winemaker. And that, I think, is being the biggest hurdle for the use of the non-Saccharomyces yeast.
It's almost like the market needs to wake up to the potential. And once that happens, then the producers of these yeasts will no doubt do what they have to do in order to profit off that now new market.
I think the market is there, especially if you look at South African winemakers. They're very innovative and always wanting to try new things. And anything that can up the quality of the wine, they will use. The challenge has been to isolate the yeast and use it in a laboratory in small-scale winemaking where you're just working with wet cultures is no problem. But to get it into a product that you can put in a packet, that's the big challenge. And so these yeasts, when they are commercialized, they are much more expensive than your standard Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So there's also, where do you draw the line with how much are you prepared to pay to benefit a wine? And sometimes the results can be differential. They're not always then, because if you don't look after these, they might die during the fermentation. So you spend money and you don't actually reap the benefits.
I was reading about Torulaspora delbrueckii, and this sounds like an absolute miracle yeast to me. So when you say, is it really worth it? Just on paper, this yeast apparently has been shown in studies to deliver lower acetic acid level in ferments and lower ethanol concentrations in wines and higher glycerol and higher aromatic esters. And it sounds like this is an amazing thing that a South African winemaker would want to add in to their ferments and would be worth, whatever it cost. But it sounds like you're a little more circumspect.
If you look at all your yeast that you find in your wine during your wine production to a spontaneous fermentation. So the most ethanol tolerant will be your Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and then the next one would be Torulaspora delbrueckii. So on its own also won't be able to get your fermentation to dryness if you were working in a complete sterile environment. So a wine cellar is never sterile. So if you do use this yeast, it's going to ferment and your natural Saccharomyces cerevisiae will take over and finish the fermentation. Unless this yeast uses up all the nitrogen, then there's nothing for the Saccharomyces to continue with. Under stressful conditions of, say, high sugar, and if you look at something like the Sauterne style of wine or Noble Late Harvest style of wine, where you're not wanting to ferment all the sugar to dryness, then Torulaspora delbrueckii does have a bit of an advantage in that under those conditions, Saccharomyces cerevisiae can form some volatile acidity, and Torulaspora tends to form less volatile acidity. So in that respect, it has been shown to be quite good for sort of your Noble Late Harvest style of wine. Where you want some residual sugar. But if you were wanting to make a totally dry wine, it probably wouldn't be good enough. But then you must also just remember that when you're talking about these yeasts, we're talking about many different strains. In Saccharomyces cerevisiae, there are 200 plus different strains that you can find commercially. There are many hundreds, thousands more that aren't commercialized. The same with the Torospora. There are various strains available that you can buy. And then there are many more lying in culture collections all over the world that have not been commercialized for one or another reason. There might be something better out there. There obviously are ones that are much worse.
So it can do all the things that it says it can do. It's just it can't do it on its own.
Correct. I think with all these, the non-Saccharomyces, you do need your Saccharomyces cerevisiae to sort of complete the fermentation.
Perhaps it was about a decade ago that there were yeast companies that were releasing products that called themselves wild yeasts. And essentially that was a mix of 10 or 12 or yeast strains that would obviously have included Saccharomyces cerevisiae and a whole bunch of other ones. Is it not a possibility to develop products like that so that you're already mitigating the risk that Torospora might not complete the fermentation on its own?
Yeah, there were some products they had about 2 or 3 different yeast species in them. 1, 2, maybe 3 that were available commercially. So you inoculated with this one product and you had your non-Saccharomyces and then you had your Saccharomyces cerevisiae in a certain ratio and you didn't have to add anything else. So yeah, that was available. I'm not sure if it's on the market anymore. I think most of the yeast manufacturers now have their non-Saccharomyces in sort of separate packets so you can inoculate it separately. But obviously there's a lot of variability. The latest research has shown that a lot of these different yeasts use different sources of nitrogen, for instance. So they can deplete nitrogen or nutrients that the other yeast needs to use later in the fermentation. But then again, they can also die and they become the nutrients for the next phase of the fermentation.
Another one of the interesting non-Saccharomyces yeast I was reading about is interesting in that it seems to be a non-fermenting strain called Mechnicovia pulcherrima, which seems to act as a barrier against microbial spoilage.
I wouldn't quite say it's non-fermentative. It still has a fermentative metabolism, so it can still form ethanol. It's a much weaker fermenter, so it can be outcompeted a lot. But there are some products now available that say, well, if you use this yeast, it's basically taking the place of other yeasts because it does form some antimicrobial compounds. And as long as it's compatible with your Saccharomyces cerevisiae, you are basically filling up the ecological niche. Instead of having the spoilage organism entering, you've got the Mechnicovia, so you can then actually lower your sulfur dioxide as well. It's a relatively new product on the market. It also has other aromatics that it can impart to the fermentation.
Is this a product that you think is exciting, or are you again a little circumspect?
I'm very excited about the non-Saccharomyces yeast generally because they do play a role in what I spent most of my life researching. Some of these yeasts can be forming some esters, which can add to aromatics. Some of them also have these enzyme systems to change precursors into volatile aromatics. Some of them can work on your polyphenols, so you can improve your mouthfeel. So to go back to your question, why is a spontaneous fermentation, when it is successful, better than just a straight inoculated fermentation? And it is because all these other yeasts are also partaking in the fermentation. And there are other species like Yeasts vineae, which has been used, I think, quite successfully in South America for wine fermentations. You can do just so much in the laboratory and in small-scale wine experiments, and then it needs to be able to scale up to a product that can be sold, that has a stable shelf life, economically viable, that people can use. That is really the limitation. There's a lot of work going on, and I think there's a lot of other yeasts that have been shown that they can play a role, but it's not practically viable.
I was reading about another one being studied at Stellenbosch that could potentially eradicate Brettanomyces in a must, or at least prevent Brettanomyces from flourishing. Are there things that perhaps we haven't touched on that you think, man, this is some really exciting stuff that could change the game for winemakers?
Biocontrol is something that's actually very new and exciting, looking at different yeasts using as biocontrol agents and not necessarily then adding to the fermentation. If you're looking at lower ethanol, you could say, well, we can start in the vineyard harvesting at lower sugars, but still physiologically ripe grapes, bring them to the cellar, use an arsenal of different yeast strains that some have more respiratory metabolism, so they're using some of the sugar, not forming ethanol, they're forming other compounds. So that together with what's done in the vineyard, and then maybe some post-fermentation strategies, and ending up with a natural lower alcohol wine without actually doing any alcohol removal. There's a lot of work's been done on that as well, but unfortunately, I think up to about 3% less ethanol, but sometimes what works in the laboratory doesn't always work in the cellar.
There was another strain I was reading about called Lechancia thermotolerans.
The Lechancia thermotolerans, its claim to fame is it forms lactic acid, so it can utilize some of your sugar forming lactic acid, which obviously can increase your acidity in your wine. So especially the Europeans are really looking at this, and they are, I think, much more worried about climate change than maybe we are. And they're looking at scenarios where they need to increase the acidity in their wines naturally. This is where this yeast could play a very nice role.
It feels like there's a lot of South African winemakers who would much rather not have to acidify as well. And so I suppose that would be something that could greatly benefit us too.
Yeah.
And then another question I wanted to ask about is there are winemakers who, especially those who work with vineyards from a number of different regions, who claim that they are meticulous with their cellar hygiene and they scrub everything down and sterilize everything so that when they bring in fruit from perhaps the Swartland for this batch and from Stellenbosch for that batch, that the native ferments that take place really are purely from the grapes and not from the cellar environment, because they're very keen on making sure that we understand that these are purely from their region. Is it possible to isolate ferments that completely, that you can say without a doubt that the native yeasts that are fermenting in one batch come purely from the grapes, and in the next batch it's purely from those grapes as opposed to from the cellar?
I don't think that's quite possible. Yes, you're bringing in your grapes with its indigenous population of yeast, which is fine, and then you're processing it through your cellar. So unless you're building a new cellar every day, complete new equipment, I doubt that you're going to get your cellar environment. So it's not a laboratory. It's a working area. You're never going to get it so sterile that you are only working with the yeast that is coming with the grapes. The cellar equipment will have a resident population. Your cellar will have a resident population. They're going to be there whether you want them or not.
Neil, thank you so much for giving your time today. I really appreciate your very measured approach, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Yes, thank you very much. You too.
We've reached the end of another episode of the Vidimark podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing to the channel so that you can join us for more conversations around wine commerce, wine science, cellar mastery, marketing, and the rising trends amidst the industry's more adventurous pioneers.